Awesome, thank you, Amy. Yeah, well done for hanging on. I'm going to shake about a little bit because I'm a little bit like an Energizer bunny when I like to give a bit of a talk, so feel free to shake out your limbs and get your heart going because we've got an hour, but we've got an hour of fun. And I'm going to try and not be a game show host, but it's going to fall a little bit like that as we go through because we're at the end of the day. So I'm going to set a little bit of an intro as to who we are and kind of what we do and set the precedent for why we've got such brilliant speakers that you're going to love. So on the board is a little phrase. That's what we do at Centric Lab. We are building radical infrastructure for communal healing. What does that really mean? It means that we're prototyping ways to use health and scientific evidence to support justice movements. As we try and understand our pathways out of the struggles that we're in, how do we, and I'm going to borrow a line that I heard from Farzana earlier, how do we build this post-capitalist infrastructure we need for healing in community and in place? And so some of the things that we're doing is understanding the different sort of and non-Western epistemologies about health, about being, and how these translate into new structures that we need to live by. So I'm going to play on the word reimagined a little bit. And this is actually a picture of dynamic glass and something that Centric were doing in, I think, 2017. We were trying to put together a scientific experiment when we were a different type of organization to help a dynamic glass company understand whether certain conditions of light would support cognitive function. It's a pretty straightforward question that lots of scientists try and understand. The only problem was that it was really hard to actually isolate the two variables because you didn't know how someone's going to walk into a building and the conditions from the night before, the week before, the year before, the chronic experiences that they may have been experiencing may have an effect on how they sit down to do a task. So the condition of light was kind of irrelevant based on the simple factors, what was the condition of their sleep the night before? So we heard earlier about social housing, the conditions that people live in. What if that heating was on full time during the summer? Were people actually able to sleep? And you compare that to someone's sort of homeostasis arriving who might have been living in a nice rural environment surrounded by sheep where I actually now live, not there, but yes, surrounded by sheep in Wales. And so when you arrive at a desk, based on that journey, that condition, that urban lived experience, you're going to be in a very different physiological state, which is going to change how you kind of have a cognitive function. How do we know this? Well, in neuroscience, which isn't just the story of what goes on behind psychology, you have a central nervous system, and that's what the study of neuroscience is, the brain and the central nervous system. So our team, and I'm not a scientist, don't worry, I'm not going to scare you with complex terms, but it's a way to understand. We have this thing called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. We kind of colloquially can know this as the kind of fight or flight system, but really it's about the stress response. So this has been our way of communicating with the world around us since effectively we have become human beings. If you think about some terrible analogies, if you have a bus flying towards you, or in other cases like an animal, your body will go, uh-oh, and have to respond and produce things like adrenaline. But this also happens in the way that our skin will be sensing heat, the skin will be sensing cold, the way that our bodies will also be ingesting particulate matter and going, hang on, this isn't quite right. This is causing an inflammation because it's not necessary for me. I've got to produce something to respond. And so what happens is you go through this entire process, and unfortunately, when that process is chronic, it leads to a dysregulation of the system because it's only meant to be temporary, not continually exposed. And what we find is that in urban environments, there is a chronic exposure to things like air, noise, light, and heat, these environmental factors that cause this stress response system to chronically engage and lead to a dysregulation. The only issue is that this system is helping mediate things like your immune system, your endocrine and your hormone system, as well as your metabolic system. These fundamental things that we need to live and live by. And so it becomes, there we go. So how do we kind of understand those kind of factors from an urban point of view? Well, some of the things that we tried to do was go, well, if we know that air pollution exists and noise pollution exists and light pollution exists and heat pollution exists, and we know that the experiences of deprivation as an indicator towards those kind of psychosocial stresses, those factors that we cannot escape. The idea of being in insecure housing that we know we cannot escape. The fact that we live in an environment where the schools are not good enough for our children, we know we cannot escape that factor. And we know that there may be other structural marginalizations and deprivations that we occur that we cannot escape. Those are burdens upon our system. And that acts as a form of wear and tear. So one of the things that we did, for example, as a tool was create one by mapping all of those different data sets together and getting a nice sort of heat map. And some people would say, like in a local authority, oh yeah, we've seen that kind of stuff with the index of multiple deprivation. You go, but yes, but you're framing it from an economics point of view, not from a human and a health point of view. And once you reimagine how you're actually framing an urban environment, you start to rethink the solutions. So I wouldn't say just take my word on it. I'll get to the other smarter people, but it's a way of understanding. If we start to look at the urban environment from the experience point of view, we can better understand that our health is not static. It is not constrained to the fact that we may eat a certain food or go exercise. It is a constant dynamic interaction with the world around us. So the built, living and social, and don't take my word for it, and I take that man with a great beard, it's always a good sign, but these are two fantastic researchers. So on the left, Professor Arlene T. Geronimus, coined in 1992. At the time, it was called the weathering hypothesis, now known as the weathering effect. Her question was, why were there disproportionately worse health outcomes in racialized African-American women, often single, often working? The question was not, is it their ethnicity, it was a condition of their health, but actually the structural marginalizations and the intersectional marginalizations were a cause of wear and tear on the system, suppressing that immune system, dysregulating the endocrine as well as things like metabolic systems. So it's no wonder we see different types of health conditions in those who have been racialized. It is not a condition of their ethnicity, but the environments in which they have been forced to live for not only 5, 10, but maybe 500 years. And Professor Robert Sapolsky, who I recommend that if that link still works, a really good an interview that talks about the experience of poverty. Sapolsky is a neuroendocrinologist, far smarter than me, but I recommend listening to him talking about the experience of poverty and its wear and tear on our systems. So this is Professor Nick Tyler, who's actually a professor of, as he calls it, civilized engineering. And when we start to think about our lived experience in the urban environment, and one of the things that we try to use about it, for example, from our point of view about sort of neuroscience in this way, he said a great line, which helps us kind of re-understand, because when people think about, oh, let's design buildings that make us healthy, let's design urban environments that make us happy, it's actually a very incorrect term and sort of framing to look at it, because you're trying to take a very episodic experience, this kind of short-term elation of an idea, and extrapolate it to a spatial condition. And he said a great line that he's always thought that neuroscience is less about space and more about time. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to kind of get on and talk about a little bit more. And that in our point of view, the ability to use something like the central nervous system and the HPA axis as a way to understand people's time in these built environments, their long-term experiences, and what are the infrastructures, and in this case, the post-capitalist infrastructures that are going to be needed if we're going to reimagine actually retrofitting the urban and built environment and that social infrastructure. If we just continue in the same way, we're just going to create effectively electric vehicles, but for the built environment. Anyone knows that if you want to reduce air pollution, you don't change electric vehicles, you change the actual dynamic as why someone gets in a car in the first place. So the more we kind of see design as the only solution, we're always going to think of design solutions. So there's, I won't think of that analogy, but it moves away from the kind of the lived realities that we have. And this is, I'm just going to quickly go through this. For example, I think it's the NHS talk about good housing is a condition for good health. So when someone does a health impact assessment on a new regeneration scheme, it goes, new housing, good for people's health, great. But what is the quality of that housing? Does it actually reflect the lived experience of many of us? What does it mean to multi-generational living? What does it mean to people who work from home? All of those conditions. So this is from Numa Studio, and they looked at a project of what does it look like for people, for example, in Enfield, and interviewing people who live in the borough and better understand what is the type of housing typology that would better suit how people live. So it's not a question of space, it's a question of how people live in this time, and how does design respond. The same way that when we think about green space, everyone thinks, yeah, yes, green space. So this actually comes from the health impact assessment. And as it talks about, and I don't expect you to read it, but if you want, you can read it. But it talks about, yes, we need proximity to green space because we can build green space, and green space is good for people's health. But under what conditions, how and why? Is it actually good for their health, or are we thinking about it purely in a spatial term, not a human term? And the reason I bring that up is that we actually did a study, it's actually for a developer called Lendlease, trying to look at the relationship between green space and childhood obesity. And actually, when you look at the statistics, there was no correlation between proximity to a green space and health outcomes. There were worse, for example, childhood obesity health outcomes in Barking and Dagenham, which has some of the highest levels of green space. So the question isn't necessarily, do we build and therefore they will do well? The question is, well, actually, what is the point of green space? What is the point of nature when it actually relates to our own health and our own systems? And so you speak to a microbial ecologist, someone like Dr. Jake Robinson, and they'll just start to talk about the microbiome that comes from green spaces. So many of us will know when we step into deep nature and you crush the leaves and the sticks and the mud beneath you, you will smell something. And that's kind of your body going, yum, I needed those enzymes. I needed that bacteria. Not only my skin microbiome, but my gut microbiome needed that nutrients, because that's actually how we're meant to live. So when we think about green space, are we actually just delivering grass, or actually delivering something that actually is meaningful to us in not only a child's development or perhaps a pregnant person's development and in the in-womb experience of that child and how that relationship is? So the idea of we build a park, we think in spatial typologies, we're going to miss the point exactly of our lived experience and what it means. So unfortunately, Sophie has had to disappear. But I wanted to kind of set a scene as when we talk about health, for example, in the built environment, it's a great biological metric to question all those different determinants that come together and influence everything around us. I've talked about how we have to think about our lived experience, how we have to build a new infrastructure that is representative to that, and not just think about the built environment in a form of spatial typologies. And so I have some wonderful speakers here. So I'm going to get a little bit game show now. I'm going to try and get a little bit Cilla Black, which is one for the kids out there, and ask everyone to kind of give themselves a 30 to 60 second intro, just who you are, what you do, and then we're going to go into some questions and we're going to explore a little bit more about this topic. So, Hannah, over to you to go first.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Hannah Yu-Pearson, and I'm a researcher and practitioner of Chinese healing practices, and I have a background in sustainable urbanism, in city-level climate action, and I'm currently working at the intersection of urbanism, health, as well as Chinese philosophical frameworks like Taoism. And I've been contributing to Centric's research on traditional ecological knowledge systems, as well as bits of other work that they're doing. So I'm excited to share a bit of these overlaps with you all and how it relates to retrofit and the built environment.
I'm Farzana. I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors at Healing Justice London. We work to build capacity for transformation on a structural level, on an interpersonal level, and on a movement and sustained level. My background's in community organizing and youth work, and I also think it's important to visualize, because this work requires so much creativity. There's an artist and creative in me, and not always organizing around despair and fight, but also organizing around vision and hope.
My name's Akil. This is also my colleague and brother, Seth. And we're directors of Resolve Collective, which is an interdisciplinary design collective. We work between art, architecture, engineering, and technology to address social issues. A lot of the work revolves around a design philosophy called using the site as a resource. And for us, that means the appraisal and also the valuing and celebration of local materials, but also local knowledges. We're based in Croydon, which has unfortunately been on the news recently. I'm sure some of you have seen that. And that's where our HQ is, but we have a translocal approach, so we are often in many, many places and trying to feed back the knowledges and the experiences from all those places as well. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Actually, this first question is for you, Farzana. You're going to go up first. So can you speak into the ways in which Healing Justice London has been building transformative research culture, something you mentioned just before, and the methodologies you use, and perhaps speaking to some of the projects, such as Deaths by Welfare and Litany for Survival. And yeah, we're going to open it up for 5 to 10 minutes at the most. And it's the same for everyone. Allow yourself to expand, be free.
Thank you. And also thank you for... I didn't know I was going to be able to make this today, and very last minute I had said to Imi I can actually make it, and then I ended up on 2 panels. So I'm sorry if you're hearing me twice today, opening and closing. And I think I'll pick up on some of the things I touched on in the morning. I spoke much more to vision in the morning, and today I think right now I'll speak to strategy and methodology and try and do some connective work. I also want to reference that the phrase post-capitalist infrastructure I learned from Alnur Lada's work, so citation is feminist memory. So I just want to say that's where I'd kind of heard that phrase. In terms of our work at Healing Justice London, I maybe want to begin around the ways in which we've been, where we're located. So a lot of our work has come from decades of community work, organizing particularly for communities that experience marginalization, who are dispossessed from space, including their own bodies, and our bodies are sites of harm, and we don't get to inhabit any space. There's no space in which, so if we're talking about spatial justice, what does that mean when you don't get to just be? And that's an ontological question, but it's also one of justice and how we do the work of healing and health. And Healing Justice has really been in that kind of process of learning. What does it mean for us to be here? And what are the conditions and contexts that support our being here in ways that are safe, dignifying, and ensure like mutual thriving? We never intended to have like a research culture, but what we knew was that the ways in which we were understanding and being understood were deeply colonial, capitalistic, disembodied, and reproduced harm on our communities. And so we were trying to community evidence gather in lots of different ways. Like, what does it mean for us to document what we know, what we're finding and discovering? And a lot, we use this phrase lived experience, but essentially that's what it was, is that we don't see ourselves represented in the standard knowledge production that is seen as valid. So how do we do it on our own terms and make that valid and robust and accessible? Along the road, we started a piece of research called A Litany for Survival in homage to Audre Lorde, and it really looked at the relationship between loss and bereavement and race, and really kind of connected the level of structural loss that marginalized communities, particularly racialized communities, had ongoingly, and that is a form of chronic stress, as a way of slow violence, that you're constantly undergoing multiple forms of loss. And there's a really interesting study by Nina Vaswani where she looks at, if you experience multiple forms of loss, you enter a place called non-recovery, which leads to things like a risk-taking behavior of substance, reliance, being homeless, all these types of things. And what we see as a correlation to that is a relationship between multiple forms of loss and the carceral prison system. So currently up to 90% of the adult male population have experienced up to six bereavements. So structurally, these things matter, like oppression, the ways in which our experiences live out, then live out in the structures. And it's a feedback loop, as Indy said earlier. Through that research, a piece of work that we have right now is called Deaths by Welfare, and it's led by my incredible colleague, Dr. China Mills, who is leads in incredible global decolonial mental health and suicidality. And this piece of research, built with disabled activists, what it has done is it has charted 50 years of welfare reform and its links to the suicides of disabled and chronically sick people. And I'm not anti-welfare. I grew up on a council estate with benefits, and our lives depend on welfare. But currently, that design harms so many of us, especially those that are racialized or working class. And so, what we found with this timeline is essentially it was community evidencing. People put into this research, which documents the 50 years, has testimonies from coroners and autopsy reports saying this person was not fit for work, suicide notes, bereaved family members' testimonies. And so what we've done is that we've built this timeline, and then the timeline is going to be exhibited at Block 336 from October the 11th to November the 11th. There's an online accessible timeline as well, and artists have also worked with us, particularly disabled artists or lived experience, to interpret the timeline so we can start to evidence what is happening, but specifically speaking to this issue of designed violence. Like when we're talking about spatial justice, we also need to talk about not just hostile design, but the designing of the ways in which our lives, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about it, organized abandonment, that it's structural, and because it's designed, we can design out of it too. It takes a lot of creativity and imagining and retrofitting, reimagining, but it's possible. And one of the frameworks that I want to also point to is disability justice, because disability justice as a framework led by disabled folks really speaks to this thing that we live in societies designed to deem certain bodies valuable, disposable, or desired. And what would it mean for us to design our environments, our societies, our contexts, our communities with the design principles that held our dignity, that held the genius of sick bodies and disabled bodies, because all of us will face disability and sickness at some point. And that's not the reason we would do it, but actually to hold other types of frameworks that understand what it means to affirm life and be life-affirming. And this is not new as well. These are in our indigenous technologies. In the Muslim tradition, we have a waqf system, which is a cradle-to-grave welfare system. So it exists already for many of us in our traditions, where you're looking at social provision that holds the totality of someone's experiences, but also the vulnerabilities that they might encounter in life. I want to just very quickly, do I have time? What are we doing for time? Very quickly touch on a few, I want to give an example, but a few methodology points that are central to our practice. You've heard me talk about it earlier this morning, somatics, and somatics not just being a connection to the body, but soma being that we are living, changing organisms in connection with the body, each other, the land, and that we're evolving, and it's this organism that is embedded in multiple forms of connectivity. And so we use somatics as a way to repair the violence of disconnection, to have a different relational politics, to understand what it means to have an interface, a bodily interface, an emotional interface, a spiritual interface, an intellectual interface with our environment, and then know how to respond to it or be met by it. And so these things are really important, and as we start to repair our reality through this lens, we're able to design better futures, better environments, lived experience that we really understand. Those that live at the sharpest edges are the people most equipped and are already surviving and possessing a genius because they've survived it. And what would it mean to resource that genius to have sustainable solutions and strategies that contribute to a robust mainstream and everyone can benefit from it. Trauma work. We know that from when we're traumatized, and lots of people have talked about it, we actually can't imagine. We can't move from a long-term imagining space. The allostatic load, the cumulative trauma that Josh spoke to, means that we are in self-preservation mode, that we can only think of the self, not the we, but we also can't think long-term. So if we want radical futures that are sustainable, we need to be doing the trauma work in order to be able to politicize trauma work, in order for us to be able to vision in ways that don't reproduce and re-erect the structures of violence that we experience. I just want to give a very clear example because it's already happening. And I think Civic Square, you do that work. So I want to say when I came to B16, my heart expanded because of the ways in which you are doing the deep structural work as well as the community repair that's needed in tandem. But I was recently, and this is to shout out to Gabriela Gomez-Mont, who was the Chief Creative Officer of Mexico City, where she was building care blocks. I had the honor of being with her in Colombia and Bogota, where they have been building care blocks. And what care blocks are essentially blocks where you have different types of social provisions, all within 30 minutes walk, from laundry rooms that save women 7 hours a week in terms of doing laundry, spaces for education for children that are below the age of 3 that can be taken care of, provisions for the elderly, spaces for gender justice and men to learn about emotional literacy because gender-based violence is a huge thing. But the heart of the care blocks was that these were spaces that were for women who held an economy that held invisible labor, 9 in 10 women being carers. And the main thing that you would ask them is what do you need? And they said time. They needed time, as you spoke to Josh, in order to be able to live the lives that they wanted to live. And this care economy that they were holding was the thing that was also revealing what does it mean to build care-filled societies. We needed spaces of education, spaces of rest, spaces where children could be taken care of. And it's already live. There's 20 care blocks across Bogota where they can't actually build the local infrastructure. They've built buses to go into the rural area. So I really encourage you to look at Gabriela Gomez's work and Bogota as an example of having this care infrastructure that can be built, and it's happening, and I really want to leave it at that point. And it's the work that we are working towards at Healing Justice London as well, prototyping localized infrastructure like that.
Oh, round of applause, yeah. Thank you very much, Farzana. I think you can see in my excitement to try and get to the talk, I kind of miss a little bit of a preface that one of the things we're trying to uncover in this is that from the kind of wider architecture, engineering, construction sectors, who are we speaking with and what is the literature that we're following? Are we just following things that come out of the RIBA and the BREEAMs, etc.? But why is an architect, for example, not actually reviewing what a health impact assessment is, for example, that type of documentation? Who is delivering that type of assessment? Who are the stakeholders involved in that? We have to kind of reimagine that type of kind of networked infrastructure. And I think building on part of what Farzana has just talked about, I think there's a straight line to the work you've been doing, part of the Urban Health Council programme on traditional ecological knowledges. And I think that it's something that you'll go into detail about, but you know, it's gaining a lot of momentum in the design world, the idea of like, oh, let's bring in kind of like indigenous thoughts, etc., and deliver it, you know, a bunch of green in front of an office building. But there's a lot more to that. In the same way that if we just think about, if you go look at census data, for example, in the UK, we don't recognise the term indigenous. The idea that BIPOC doesn't exist in the English and UK literature, it does in the United States. And so we have a group of people who identify with indigeneity being erased. So it's very messy if we just were to focus on looking at census data, look at a place and go, oh, okay, well, there's this type of people, this type of people, this type of people. We know how to do that, but that's not actually representative. So I guess, Hannah, can you start to expand on some of the framings that it means to not only recognise people who identify indigenous to look and live with indigeneity as a way of being, but the principles around engagement and kind of what it means for the kind of the future of urban systems?
It's a big question. So with Centric and Urban Health Council, we've been working on principles for how to engage with traditional ecological knowledges, which is knowledge from indigenous peoples, from land-kin peoples, and people that work with like an ecology that's like really deep-seated in their own practices. And it's important to see this traditional ecological knowledge as a plural term. It's plural. There's many different forms of knowledge. And the way this comes into a design process or a design discourse is you can't hack your way in the current system with like a cool thing that can be done somewhere else. So it's like bearing in mind that traditional ecological knowledge is coming into design. It's being called low tech, like TEK, and it's being called low tech or all these things. So there's different framings that indigenous knowledge and ecological knowledge is being put that's really to the side and trying to maybe give it a seat at the table. But the whole idea of this is not to give tech a seat at the table, but kind of to just think, get rid of the table itself, or just like come off it, you know, like you can't bring in what is like knowledge that is so deep inside of people into like a design hack or like a way to like do a master plan. So yeah, it's thinking about knowledge as it's known in the body, as it's known relationally, and how can you, as you're approaching traditional ecological knowledge, how can you be ready to receive what that is? So it's not just being like, oh, let me just like learn a few things, but it's like this knowledge is so deep, it's really spiritual, it's passed down ancestrally, it's from the land. So how can I, with humility, come to this knowledge ready to receive it with humility? And in the process of this requires a level of dethroning the English language. It requires like putting your brain to the side a little bit and feeling a bit more. It requires to like put your worldview to the side and be like, there are contexts and conditions that are framed the way I see the world, and there are contexts and conditions that I can learn about and become conscious of. So I'll come back with some examples, but with Araceli Camargo, like, steered the ship of this piece of work, and Abdi Hassan, Angela Camacho, Grace Carson, and Dr. Natalie Alassi Canales and myself came up with some principles for how to engage with this knowledge, and also a living encyclopedia of this knowledge system as it relates to urban systems and the built environment. So the 5 principles is kinship, which is about knowingness, it's about biodiversity, and it's about lived experience of the other than human kin as well, and the need for nourishment for the other than human kin. The second principle is nothing about us without us. So if any group are trying to implement some like really cool indigenous thing, just if there's no one in the room that can speak to that is like from that, then it's to really understand that those people need to be brought into the spaces, or the people that are in those design spaces need to like look outside of themselves and maybe pass the power of design on. The third is mutualistic symbiosis, which is about deep harmony and reciprocity. The fourth is love, and part of love is aliveness. And this is, I think, is like really important when we're thinking about the built environment, is that we think about buildings as inanimate objects. But there are so many lives that go into not just the building, but also the materials in the building. There's so much exploitation, there's so much extraction, there's so much corruption and lives lost in the process of building our buildings, both in the present moment and also in the futures to come. And it's to give that aliveness back to the places that we're living in. And the last one is dignity, and this speaks to Farzana's point about epistemic freedom, and it's about having the dignity of your imagination being included and actualized and materialized in the world around you. So these are the principles that we've been working with, and I thought I'd give you some examples of how I bring in Chinese ecological knowledges and traditional Chinese healing practices into my way of looking at urban systems and urban design. And it's to think about reframing what the body is. So in Chinese medicine, the body, because the skin is porous, the body includes the spaces around it. So when we're in this building, my body is the collective body of all of us. My body includes the building as well, and it includes the city that I'm in. If I'm walking in a woods, because of the exchange of the air that I'm breathing, because of my feet being on that earth, then my body is also the woods, and the woods is also my body as well. So bodies are processes of embodiment, and the body is a site of knowledge and of practice as well. And that, from an ecological health perspective, is that I cannot be well if the air is not well. I cannot be well if you are not well. So health is not some individual pursuit. It's done in community, it's done in practice, and it's like a constant dynamic process. And when I think about how this applies to urban systems and retrofit, is if we think about the essence of what retrofit is and what the need for retrofit is that there's a misalignment in form, in function, and in time. So we need to be moving like in relation to the times that we're in. And there's a saying in Chinese medicine that's you treat the person according to the time, according to the place, and according to the person. So if you're living, I don't know, your illness might be to do with the season that you're in, but it could also be to do with the times that you're living under, which is this world that we're all living in. It could also be the place. You might be living in a very damp place, but it could also be the earth that you're on, and it's your body in relation to all of those things. So health is not about not being sick. It's about being at one, and it's about being adaptable with the changes around you. And this requires a level of alignment and a consciousness of the potential that you have. And because in Chinese medicine, illness is caused by misalignment to time, place, and relation. So when we think about the body and we think about healing, it requires us to think with built environment professionals. It requires us to think in terms of like, where is the pavement? What material is the pavement made out of? And all of these things are really key to us even conceiving of what good health is. And feng shui is often seen as a really like spiritual, superstitious thing, but when we think about the feng shui of cities, and in ancient China, many cities were built according to the topography of the land. They were built facing certain directions because of prevailing winds, and there was a lot of like deep consciousness and knowledge of where you were, and you weren't just like building anywhere and maximizing use from anything. You were thinking about what was the climate, what was the geography, what was people's movement, and how can a space be adaptive to all of those things. And yeah, I just wanted to open up the possibility of retrofit and reimagining retrofit as being how do we think about form and function and time, but not just in our buildings, also in our relationships, also in our systems, and how can we think, how does how does changing the form improve the function, but also what does a change in function mean in our relationship to time? So there's lots that I can keep going on and on about, but I really encourage you to look on the traditional ecological knowledges, on the Urban Health Council. They have a big Miro board that has all of these conversations on it. There's lots of audio reports. But yeah, really engage with the principles beforehand, and please come to that work with a lot of spaciousness if you can afford it, and a lot of receptivity.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Hannah. There was so much beauty in that. Thank you. I actually just received some text messages from Araceli going, please shout out the link. She's doing such a good work. So Hannah was referring to, if you do remember this off the top of your head, urbanhealthcouncil.com. That's all one word. And then I think it's / if you go to reports, you'll see the access and the open access library of, I think there are 4 pieces of work related to that. So yeah, thank you for the incredible work you've done there. The shout outs we're getting from it thus far are really inspiring. Less about us though. There were a couple of things that you said that I think really fits into Seth and Akhil's, and I think there's talk that they're going to just kind of introduce. There was one part about the idea of like not being invited into a space, and in Elite Capture, Olufemi Taiwo talks about like the idea of deference politics and how to go into those environments when we're not actually allowed really to be in those environments. They're not designed for the conversations that we are trying to have. We become costumes, basically, for a show. And in that book, he talks about how the need to create epistemic authority was something that the residents of Flint, Michigan needed to do, and how they aligned themselves with different scientists and different groups, and how they created their own space in order to kind of carve their way out of this trouble when interfacing with the system in front of them was leading them to nowhere. And I guess there's a lot that you guys kind of do in that space about creating that infrastructure for discussion, for not just kind of imagining, but creating. And you create an infrastructure because many don't exist. And one of the ones you're doing right now is around materiality and these conversations and understanding how do we actually look at the materials of this built environment, and how do we kind of operate and work in this kind of false notion of a capitalist circular economy, and the kind of the messiness or the BS behind ESG frameworks and stuff like that. So I guess going to kind of invite you to open up around that kind of topic of kind of creating these new rooms, these kind of existential rooms, and maybe if you want to focus on materiality to start, but I'll let you be free. It's your room.
I can do. Well done for tying those together. I was thinking to myself, like, oh, how's he going to do this? But I like that a lot. Maybe what I can do is like start by talking about a bit about our journey and how we arrived at this question of infrastructure, because as I said to Josh downstairs, like we're slightly new to maybe the room that we're in now, and I think that's maybe a skill that we've developed or something that we're really interested in, is like how can we navigate some of these different disciplines to think about collective issues that we're all trying to overcome. So it's not about being kind of disciplined by the discipline, but it's about navigating and collaborating and working collectively. So we, in 2016, we started in an area that was hyper familiar to us in Brixton. And when you're from South London, Brixton is one of the kind of like pinnacles of your knowing. It's one of the pinnacles of London. It's like, you know, Croydon, Brixton, and that's about it. And we're really interested in how we can start to create spaces for communities like ourselves and marginalised communities to discuss topics, to imagine, to explore, to create, and to do that together. And that was, if anyone remembers 2016, hopefully it wasn't that too long ago, that was in the backdrop of kind of a recent wave of gentrification in Brixton. So there was no surprise that the conversations that we were having, a lot of them were about how we can create spaces for ourselves and the communities that we want to support. This was a kind of, we landed on this way of working, so Akhil, myself, and Gam, who we founded it with, we didn't really have kind of grand aspirations of developing a methodology and traveling across the country and working with local communities across the country. Actually, we were just really interested in how we can make space for these communities that we were a part of. But what we did was we stumbled upon something that was slightly interesting. We stumbled upon something that was also super fun as well. I think thinking about these processes as spaces that create joy is also really important. And what we did was we developed a methodology. So Akil talks about using the site as a resource. We talk about working with local communities. We talk about valuing tacit knowledge. We did some more work in South London, but then we also developed a methodology that allowed us to travel across the country, to travel across Europe as well, and to think about how we can work hyper-locally and still try and kind of get over this question of creating space. A kind of spatial practice in urban environments are places that we kind of developed in. It's places that we learned a lot from. So we were really interested in creating space for these people. And then I think somewhere in about 2021, we stumbled upon a conversation with Imi and slightly with Farzana as well. There was conversations circling around. And what we were finding is that in this mission to create space, we had actually adopted an approach that was probably more similar to like a professional services organization, to an architecture firm, to a kind of creative enterprise, something like that. And we were finding ourselves and our bodies exhausted by the work that we were doing. So we actually had to rethink our strategy. And I think that's where we started to visit this idea of creating infrastructures rather than just doing kind of project by project. And that's kind of where we are now. So what we really wanted to do is think about how can this method become a methodology to build new infrastructures for those communities, to build capacity within those communities, within young people, within people from marginalized communities, not just to kind of access the spaces that we are creating, but to imagine new spaces, to imagine new environments, to imagine new cities. And now we're trying to kind of figure out how we pave the way for those infrastructures to become reality.
So building onto that, I think a lot of it took a kind of reflection upon what some of the traits that we were doing that weren't being professionalized and how that worked. I mean, I find it really interesting that retrofit has become a kind of really professional term when like squatters have been retrofitting for a really long time. And we were on the tail end of that. And so as a group that was from a marginalized background, we were working, doing certain things. We couldn't afford space that we could pay for, but we could squat in spaces. And so that brought us across a number of different vacant spaces across London. We were in the Docks for a long time, in Custom House. We were in Poplar for a long time. We actually, one of the funnest places wasn't too far from here. It was an old building on Berkeley Square in Green Park, in Mayfair, right opposite Sexy Fish. And that was a fun place to be. And those spaces, because of the looseness of those spaces, they became these territories where we could invite other groups, other small groups, some of whom are still around now, some of whom aren't around anymore, and to let out that space as a type of infrastructure. The space was loose, it was porous in the same way that Hannah talks about the human body. And I think that that's an important part of how we think about reimagining or retrofitting a building is not just in the kind of the materiality of that building, which is something that we focus on, but actually about everything that happens around it, the capacity that you're able to build in the exchange of those materials, the capacities and the knowledges that you're able to share in the exchange of those things, because without that intangible exchange, it's kind of all for nothing. You know, we're in Croydon at the moment. I've mentioned this before, and if you're ever down in Croydon, you know, we'd love to have you. Outside of East Croydon Station are two of the tallest modular buildings in Europe, and these modular buildings shot very fast. Obviously, that's how modular buildings are, and it was these beacons of kind of new technology. When we think of technological progress, perhaps in an adverse way, it's like these two things are shining down or beaming down on Croydon, but beneath that and around that are young people who are the victims of knife crime. Beneath that and around that are people who are experiencing homelessness. Beneath that and around that are an array of different social issues that we are all stuck in. So there's a kind of attitude where it's like, all right, who gives a fuck about technological progression, right? Like, because if technology isn't progressing with us, then we'll find ourselves at the bottom of a barrel that may look as green as you like, it may look as retrofit as you like, it may look however you want it to be. And so we have always had to start at that. And that has sometimes been, because that is the baseline for a lot of our conversations, it means that, not in a derogatory way, our stuff is always low-tech. Our stuff is always around something which is of an extraordinarily low resolution, a really base quality, you know? When we do exhibitions, when we do projects, sometimes you look at these things and you think, the fuck is that? Or you look at that thing and think, that doesn't look all that. And it's an experience that we've grown to love, because I think that unless we're using materiality, unless we're thinking about architecture and spaces as a way to challenge our assumption of what something should look like, I think it's very difficult to progress and to think about how things could look like. Today in Croydon, or at the moment in Croydon, we are experiencing a new kind of form of vacancy. And a lot of the buildings, a lot of the commercial buildings in Croydon at the moment are vacant. The council, if anyone's from Croydon Council here, shout out, has gone bankrupt for the third time in 2 years. We've been joined by Birmingham City Council, which is news to everyone's ears, which was a good thing to hear. And so we're facing a kind of low point, a nadir, one of many nadirs, but we're facing a low point in Croydon. And now is the time, if ever, for radical thought about how we can approach these types of buildings. We work as an infrastructure for lots of other practices around us, and we've recently begun to formalize ways of funding and platforming those other practices as part of a formal infrastructure. We also do that with materials, so we bring on, whenever we're producing projects, whenever we're producing exhibitions, we store those materials, we catalogue those materials, we redistribute those materials, and that's something that's done at a very small scale, and I'll go into that mention of scale in a second as well. And so what we're trying to do is to think about how do we not scale up but retain this idea of a small scale? How do we formalize the small scale? And so what we're trying to do at the moment is to raise money, to raise capital for a material store within Croydon. We're interested in how we can take that argument around circularity, but position it within the base level I was talking about. How do we ground it within exactly where people are right now in Croydon Town Centre? What does that look? What is the material store that also builds the capacity of people to even think or imagine what retrofitted or a reimagined retrofitted future could be? What does that kind of look like? And so the first case scenario is how do we take on these vacant stores? And this is like level -1. So level -1 is that the land politics of Croydon is slightly different to the land politics of the rest of London. And it's very difficult to get your hands on a space in any meaningful way. And so one of those ways is which we create arguments around why we can have that space to retrofit while we have it as a meanwhile space. So we're trying to kind of change the terms of the clause of meanwhile space agreements in order to get into those spaces. The next is then to own the space and then to think about how one kind of purchase those spaces as well. Who do you appeal to as well? What kind of constellation of bad to good funders do you then reach out to do those things as well? Which is a messy process. There are some very messy people involved in that land tapestry in Croydon and in the rest of London, many of whom have to be engaged with. Many of whom don't believe what we believe, and many of whom do not want to be in a progressive future. Many of whom are not in that final picture, right? Many of whom are not in that final picture after the revolution. But there's a messiness to having to engage with those people. There's a messiness from having to be able to speak the language of those people, whilst always having that ability to co-conspire, whilst always knowing in your heart that these are not the people who will be there in the end. And that's it's a very difficult process that we find ourselves in. We find ourselves saying no a lot of the times, when sometimes in the back of my head I think, maybe we should have just said yes. We find ourselves saying yes when sometimes we probably should have just said no. And so really like I think if anything, our journey is the hope in describing that part of our journey is to articulate what it means to be at stage -1 as an organisation of 6 people in the very peripheries of London who are working at this kind of within the kind of depths of the local. And I just want to end in about this question of scale, because this is something which I always have fun trying to address. We always have fun when we're trying to address, because we always work at such small scales. And when, not so many years ago, I used to be a maths tutor. And so that means that you're not that good at maths, but you're better at the kid that you're teaching. And I used to always, and as a way of explaining to young people, that maths is just something that you can do. There's no such thing as being good at maths or being bad at maths. You can just do the maths, especially not to do your GCSEs. We used to do a little exercise which was proving proving that 1 is actually 0.999 recurring. That the two things are exactly the same, right? And you would do that exercise by saying, if x equals 1, then let's take x as 1, and then we just divide it by, so x is 1, so it's 10 out of 10. You then take 10 out of 10, and you turn that into a fraction. But once you divide the fraction, you actually end up with 0.9999999 recurring. And that then equals to 1. And the kids will be like, wow, like, how is that even possible that these two things are the same? And it's because it's bullshit. And that's what you say, it's because it's actually fucking nonsense. And you are in control of that nonsense. That's at that point is when you say you're in control of the nonsense. I feel like we're the kids at this point. We're trying to grapple the nonsense, right? Especially in Croydon, we're trying to grapple the nonsense. But the belief that this is a construct, and the belief that, I think Scott said something about form following power in the last thing. I just caught that as I was going back. And I think the understanding that the forms that we inherit are just because of the power that forces those things to be, like that is super inspiring. That really negates all of the bullshit, all of the really, really terrible things that are happening at the moment. And it allows us to think kind of really positively. So stay focused about this material store that's coming in Croydon. It's coming to a place near you. If anyone knows anyone with any money, you know where to go. We've got a PayPal account.
I can't follow that. There's nothing more I can say. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you, Farzana. Thank you, Akil. Thank you, Seth. This has been a pleasure for me. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Give a round of applause to yourselves, because you made it all the way through as well.